Beneath the ice, something waited. In 1964, a Navy patrol vessel vanished without a trace. No distress call, no wreckage, just 23 men erased. 2 decades later, fishermen pulled up a piece of twisted metal in their nets, and inside, a single boot, a skeleton, and a flare gun still gripped in frozen bone. The dog tag read a name the Navy swore never existed, and the tape they left behind? It didn't record waves, it recorded something watching, something mimicking, something still alive. The sea was calm that morning, unusually so. The kind of stillness that makes old fishermen glance over their shoulders, wondering what might be waiting just beneath the glassy surface. The crew of the Maribel June, a rust-stained trawler that had seen better decades, worked the nets in silence. They weren't far from the Bering Strait. The water here was cold enough to shear the skin from bone if you stayed in too long, and deep enough to keep its own counsel. The men joked less the further out they sailed. Out here, superstition filled the silence where small talk once lived. As the winch began its slow groan, the net resisted. Not the usual rhythm of a heavy catch. This was something else, something reluctant to surface. Before we sink further into the cold, where sonar fades and memory drowns beneath miles of water, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support isn't just a click, it's a flare in the fog, a voice echoing across an ocean that's kept its secrets too long. Every subscription is a promise to those who vanished. We still hear you. You keep the searchlights burning in places the world has already declared empty. Thank you for listening when silence was easier. Steel strained. A thick web of seaweed choked the mesh, coiled like old rope around something heavy. The crew braced. The net emerged, sodden and dripping, its weight tipping the vessel with a creaking protest. At first, they thought it was scrap, perhaps a piece of industrial junk sloughed off a passing freighter. It wasn't unusual for nets to dredge up rusted hull fragments or lost crab pots. But the object that lay tangled in the rigging was different. Twisted and dark, it had the unmistakable shape of man-made intent, sharp angles, seams, rivets. Years underwater had eaten at its skin, corroded its form into a grotesque sculpture of itself. Barnacles clung to every surface, and a thick sludge of silt and algae coated the metal in a diseased green hue. One of the younger deckhands stepped forward, scraping away at the muck with a boat hook. The moment his pole struck metal, it rang with a dull, hollow note. He paused, narrowed his eyes. Something gleamed faintly beneath the grime, not silver, not gold, but brass. Faint letters carved into a small, circular plate. Another scrape, this time by hand. Silence spread across the deck like fog. The plate was a military insignia, battered and worn, but still legible through the tarnish. An eagle with wings outstretched, the anchor below it, and the faded curve of block letters around its edge. United States Navy. No one spoke for a long time. They examined the surrounding debris, suddenly reverent in their movements. A segment of what might have once been a hatchway jutted from the core. Another portion, bent at an unnatural angle, appeared to be part of a communications array, now crushed inward like it had been clamped in the jaws of something massive. There was no numbering, no identification marks, nothing to easily trace. Just rot and time and silence. One of the older crewmen, a man with gray threaded through his beard and cigarette burns across his knuckles, turned away and spat into the sea. "Should have left it down there," he muttered. No one disagreed. Later, when they tried to contact the Coast Guard, their radio crackled with static, the kind that bends and pulses like a breath too close to your ear. The ship's instruments glitched, navigation screens blinking nonsense coordinates. By the time they reached shore, the wreckage had begun to stink not of salt and seaweed, but of metal long rotted from the inside out, and something else beneath that, something old and sweet, and wrong. And embedded in that first piece, tucked between a shattered bolt casing and a collapsed panel, they found it. A name tag, curled and barely clinging to its rusted brackets. Eldridge Bay. January 3, 1964. The sky above the North Pacific was slate gray, heavy with the threat of snow, as the USS Eldridge Bay slipped away from port under the cover of pre-dawn darkness. No brass bands, no waving families. Just the churn of its twin propellers and the quiet resolve of 23 men bound for the Arctic shelf on orders stamped classified. A Thresher-class patrol vessel, compact but sturdy, the Eldridge Bay had been hastily retrofitted in late 1963 with updated sonar equipment and a reinforced hull. The modifications weren't standard, nor were the mission parameters. The men aboard didn't ask too many questions. Most of them were young, some just boys with fresh-pressed uniforms and neatly folded letters from sweethearts back home. Others were lifers, veterans of Korean waters and black-inked operations whose names never made it into the newspapers. Among them, Lieutenant Commander Frank Halverson, 41, father of two, commander of the Eldridge Bay, and known among his crew for his even temper and superstitious habits. Every mission began with the same ritual. A single match struck, held until it burned to his fingers, then dropped into the sea. A small offering, a silent pact with whatever forces ruled the waves. The ship's route was to take it north of the Aleutian Islands, then curve eastward toward a stretch of Arctic water rarely patrolled, a corridor of ice and black water near an undersea ridge known only by coordinates. No explanation was given as to why this area, why now. The briefing had been thin, anomalies detected. Monitor, record, report. No engagement unless ordered, no deviation from course. They were told they would be gone no more than 6 weeks. They were never seen again. No distress signal was received. No weather anomaly reported in the area at the time. The last contact came via encrypted radio, a standard check-in, nothing unusual. After that, silence. When they missed their next scheduled transmission, search efforts were launched. Icebreakers were dispatched, aircraft scanned the corridors, but no trace of the Eldridge Bay or its crew was ever found. No oil slick, no debris field, just endless white and cold, stretching far beyond the reach of any signal or scream. Behind closed doors, whispers began. That perhaps the vessel had gone too far, had brushed against something not meant to be disturbed. But officially, it was chalked up as lost due to environmental complications. A sentence with no weight, a bureaucratic grave. The families were notified with thin letters and folded flags. Missing, presumed dead. No funerals were permitted, no coffins returned. Just voids, the kind that fester in the minds of wives and mothers, in the restless dreams of children too young to remember their fathers' faces. The Navy closed the investigation after 3 months. The files were archived, then quietly sealed. Over time, the story faded from public memory. The ocean held its silence, and the names of the men stitched into uniforms, etched into metal, sank with them into the deep. But the Arctic doesn't forget. It keeps what it is given. And in the hush of winter winds, along the frozen lines where sonar dies and maps go blind, the echo of the Eldridge Bay still lingers, a name spoken not by mouths, but by currents and creaking ice, waiting to rise again. The radio room aboard the Eldridge Bay was dimly lit, its hum a quiet constant beneath the ship's shudders and groans. Petty Officer Alan Mertz, just 24 and barely 6 months into his service, sat hunched over the communications console, headphones tight over his ears. Outside, the world had turned into a white void. Sheets of freezing mist blurred the edges of the vessel, and sonar had begun to misbehave, flickering, spiking, then dropping to dead calm. Instruments failed with no mechanical cause. Needles spun, lights blinked without pattern. No storms reported. No nearby magnetic activity. And yet, something was wrong. For hours, Mertz had been trying to re-establish a stable link to base command. Their last message had gone out incomplete coordinates, A brief update on water temperature fluctuations, and then an interruption that froze the operator's hand mid-transmission. A sound had come through the headphones, not noise, but a presence. A modulation that didn't belong in any spectrum he knew. It had shape, rhythm. A low, pulsing cadence that didn't waver, didn't repeat. It felt deliberate. On the bridge, Halvorsen gave the order to retreat south, break formation, return to warmer water. But the ship wouldn't turn. Controls responded sluggishly, as if the water itself had thickened around them. Below deck, a mechanic reported hearing a groaning along the hull, like pressure from outside. "Not ice," he said. "Not like that." It was like being cupped, like something had put a hand around the vessel and was slowly closing its grip. Then, at 3:47 hours, the radio crackled to life. It started with static. Not the usual white hiss, but sharp, arrhythmic bursts, like a language with no translation. Screeches, warbles, moments of perfect silence, and then a low hum so deep it shook the wiring. The log recorded it all, a minute and 36 seconds of unidentifiable noise, each second stranger than the last. Then, abruptly, a human voice. It wasn't Mertz, it wasn't Halvorsen. The voice came from somewhere else, somewhere close, but not from the Eldridge Bay's broadcasting system. Tinny, distorted, heavy with dread. A whisper just above the level of breath. "Not ice." A pause. "It's watching." And then silence. The connection terminated itself. All channels went dead. Mertz ripped the headphones from his ears, blood trickling from where the frequency had spiked too high, rupturing the inner membrane. He would never speak again, not from trauma, from something else. Like his voice had been taken. The transmission was received by a remote outpost in Anchorage, logged by a technician who first assumed it was a prank. When he heard the playback, he filed it under distress divided by priority 1 and alerted his superior. But when Navy intelligence arrived, the log tape was confiscated. The technician was debriefed, threatened, transferred. The file was marked top secret and buried. Years later, that same technician would recall the voice during an interview he wasn't supposed to give. Eyes hollow, hands trembling, he would repeat the words exactly as he remembered them. And then fall silent for good. "Not ice. It's watching." Whatever it was that the Eldridge Bay saw in those final moments, it hadn't come from the sea. It had come from beneath it. The first thing to stop were the letters. At first, no one noticed. Mail from the Arctic took days to reach sorting stations. Longer still to travel across states and small towns and postboxes with rusted hinges. The wives waited patiently, reassured by the rhythm of previous deployments. But then days turned to weeks, and in kitchens warmed by percolators and the static of AM radios, fingers tapped at laminate tables, restless. Ruth Halvorsen, wife of Lieutenant Commander Frank Halvorsen, was the first to speak it aloud. It's been too long. She had been through enough postings to know the ebb and flow of military communication. Frank wrote faithfully, his words spare but sincere, typed on stiff Navy paper that smelled faintly of diesel and cold metal. He always signed them the same way. "Tell the kids I love them, and watch the tides." But by late February, her mailbox remained empty. The silence inside it, louder than the wind that rattled her porch. Other wives began to call. Not officially, of course. The Navy discouraged too much speculation, too much worrying chatter, as one officer put it. But the silence was communal now, stretching from coast to coast. Across Seattle, Norfolk, Mobile, and a dozen tiny towns whose sons had boarded the Eldridge Bay, the silence settled like ash. They gathered, these women, in living rooms with drawn curtains and half-knitted sweaters in their laps. They brewed coffee that grew cold as it sat untouched. They whispered the names of their husbands and sons, not aloud but in glances, in nods, in the weight of paused conversation. No one wanted to be the first to say what they all feared, that the sea had taken them and refused to give anything back. One by one, calls were placed to regional naval offices. The responses were careful, practiced, and maddening. No update at this time. The mission is ongoing. We advise patience and discretion. What was left unsaid rang louder than any statement. No one had heard from the Eldridge Bay. No one knew where it was. In late March, a representative from the Navy arrived at Ruth Halverson's home. He stood on the porch in full dress uniform, his hat tucked under one arm, his expression arranged into something that mimicked sympathy but fell short. He handed her a letter, typed and signed by someone she'd never met, someone whose name would never mean anything. The words inside were empty scaffolding. Missing. Presumed lost at sea. No further details. No remains. No closure. The other families received similar letters, folded and stamped, a silent erasure of hope. There were no funerals, no caskets draped in flags. Without bodies, there was nothing to bury. Some wives wore black, others refused. A few remarried over the years, quietly, as if ashamed. Most did not. Most kept the houses just as they were, the shoes by the door, the toothbrush untouched, the framed photos on bedside tables yellowing with time. And as the months wore on, the headlines moved elsewhere. 1964 was a year of upheaval. Protests, politics. A nation pivoting toward new fears. The sea lost its voice in the newsprint. The Eldridge Bay vanished not just from radar, but from memory. But the wives remembered. They remembered everything. The way the house creaked at night, the way the cold lingered just a little longer after the silence arrived. They wrote letters that would never be sent, tucked them into drawers, kissed them closed. They stood at kitchen sinks and looked out at the world, waiting for a knock that would not come. And somewhere beneath the ice, time stopped. The men they loved remained fixed in place, untouched by years, unreachable by letters. Still watching, still waiting. In the spring of 1964, as thawed earth gave way to the green shoots of another distracted summer, the vanishing of the Eldridge Bay was already being reshaped into something less inconvenient. Something less human. The Cold War, always hungry, devoured the narrative. Whispers of malfunction and natural hazard were traded in back rooms for something more politically useful. Sabotage, espionage. The looming specter of Soviet interference. An enemy could be blamed. Grief could be repurposed. The truth, as fragile and strange as it was, had no place in strategy briefings. In windowless rooms beneath the Pentagon, red-stamped folders passed from one desk to another. Pages were blacked out with thick strokes, names blurred into anonymity. Reports from the Eldridge Bay's final transmissions were deemed unreliable due to atmospheric interference. The sonar anomalies, spikes, and distortions recorded by the vessel's onboard systems were quietly erased from the narrative, replaced by vague mentions of electrical error. Anything that hinted at the unexplainable was filed under psychological stress, induced by Arctic isolation, a phrase repeated so often it became doctrine. A young technician stationed in Anchorage had recorded the final fragments of the Eldridge Bay's distress signal. He noted its unusual pitch, the gaps between words that seemed intelligent. His supervisor told him not to mention it again. 2 days later, he was reassigned to radar duty in Nevada. Years later, he would recall how a man in an unmarked coat had come to his bunk that night, placed a single folder on his bed, and said nothing. Inside was a page with his name, his address, and a single phrase typed neatly at the bottom. Remember what you didn't hear. And yet, not everyone stayed silent. A fisherman off the Yukon coast reported strange lights under the water in February of that year, a month after the Eldridge Bay vanished. He said they pulsed in threes, like a heartbeat. A few days later, his boat was found drifting, engine intact, gear untouched. No sign of him. Local authorities called it an accident. His family wasn't convinced. In Iceland, a NATO weather station detected seismic disturbances far beneath the ocean crust along the ship's last known trajectory. Not tremors, rhythms, pulses that came in waves, like sonar but deeper, older. The readings were passed up the chain, studied briefly, then ignored. One analyst joked in his margin notes, "Atlantis says hi." The Cold War gave convenient cover to many things. A lost patrol vessel, in the eyes of men in suits, was simply one more sacrifice to geopolitical tension. The public was told nothing. Families were told less. And beneath it all, the Arctic remained unmoved, vast, cold, and silent. It harbored its secrets in shifting ice and bone-deep cold, storing memories like fossils in the black water trenches no light reached. The Eldridge Bay was gone, that was all that mattered. But some who had glimpsed the classified files, those few who had seen the redacted reports before they were incinerated, would remember one detail above all others. A margin note, scribbled in pencil by an unnamed officer beside a sonar image pulled from the wreckage data. If that's a Russian sub, why does it have no shadow? The question was never answered. The file was stamped and shelved. The Arctic returned to its silence, the Cold War trudging on, leaving behind only ghosts and ice. The fisherman's name was Caleb Boone. He'd worked the northern waters since he was 17, his hands shaped by rope and salt, his skin weathered by a lifetime of wind. When the Maribel June dredged up that mass of warped metal and sea-gnarled ruin in 1986, Caleb was the first to lay eyes on it. The others stared with the detached curiosity of men who'd seen strange things surface before: engines, barrels, once even the rusted remains of a pickup truck from some long-forgotten disaster. But this was different. Caleb didn't blink, didn't speak, he just stared. Later, when the object had been partially cleaned and the insignia exposed, he backed away without a word, his boots scraping across the deck as if retreating from something poisonous. That night, he didn't eat. He sat on the deck long after the others turned in, a cigarette burning to ash between his fingers, his eyes fixed on the black water like it might speak again. It was the following day when he first mentioned the lights. "Beneath the waterline," he muttered, not looking up. "Like a storm without sky, like lightning, but wrong." The other men laughed nervously. Arctic waters played tricks on the eyes, they said. Cold could turn mist into illusion. They'd all seen odd things out there, strange reflections, light bending through ice crystals. But Caleb didn't answer. He simply repeated it, slower this time, quieter. It wasn't ours, wasn't natural. It was watching. He said he saw it before they pulled up the wreck. A soft shimmer, deep under the surface, glowing like phosphorescence but arranged in patterns. Not the chaotic bloom of jellyfish or stirred sediment. Lines, circles, then a flash, like a pulse from the deep, enough to rattle the hull. No one else had seen it. Or maybe no one else wanted to admit they had. 2 days later, Caleb went below deck and destroyed the ship's logbook pages from that morning. Tore them clean out, shredded them, burned the scraps in a rusted canister they used for trash. When asked why, he only said, "That thing didn't come from the sea. Not the sea we know." Back on shore, something changed in him. He stopped going to the marina, sold his boat. Neighbors noticed his lights stayed off at night. He'd sit on his porch, unmoving, staring at nothing. If someone passed by and waved, he didn't return it. He didn't blink, he barely breathed. At night, he whispered in his sleep, words no one could make sense of. Rhythms that mimicked sonar, or speech slowed to a crawl. Then, 2 weeks after the discovery, Caleb stopped speaking entirely, not out of choice. It was as though his voice had simply vanished. Doctors found no damage to his throat, no trauma to his brain. He could hear, he could understand, but he could not speak. His eyes darted when asked about that day. They filled with tears once, just once, when someone mentioned the lights. He lived like that for years, silent, diminished, watching the sea from behind his window but never approaching it again. Sometimes he would raise his hand, just slightly, when the fog rolled in, as if greeting something he'd never truly escaped. The others never spoke of it publicly. They didn't need to. The wreck had been taken by men with government tags, and the story quietly scrubbed. But every one of them remembered the moment the net broke the surface, and the weight of something more than metal touched their lives. And all of them remembered Caleb's words. Like a storm without sky. Like something that remembered them, even now. The metal was unlike anything they'd handled before. Not in shape, it resembled the battered components of an old bulkhead or a sheared comms antenna, but in condition. It didn't behave the way steel should behave after 2 decades underwater. The corrosion ran deep, yes, but it wasn't the familiar rusted flake of time and salt. It was something more brittle, more crystalline. Edges splintered in sharp, unnatural lines, and the barnacles that clung to its surface had grown in twisted spirals, as though warped by something far colder than the surrounding sea. It didn't smell like the ocean. It smelled like silence. The fragments had been offloaded discreetly at a private marina just outside Nome. The Maribel June's crew, still unsettled from the discovery, hadn't spoken to the press or even their families in detail. They kept it close, a pact sealed by something deeper than secrecy, by fear. Caleb Boone hadn't spoken at all. His silence had become a warning, a boundary the others refused to cross. So when the salvage pieces were handed over to a local harbor technician for temporary storage and inspection, it wasn't out of curiosity. It was obligation. Something had to be done. But the technician, a man named James Proctor, had enough background in metallurgy to know something was wrong the moment his tools touched the metal. The core temperature of the largest fragment, despite sitting for hours in an open-air shed, remained shockingly low. Not cold to the touch. Freezing. Proctor left frostburn on 3 fingers, just trying to lift the panel for weighing. When he finally brought in a colleague with a portable thermal scanner, the device read an internal temperature of -47 degrees Fahrenheit. Impossible. The ambient temperature that day hovered near 40 above. Word didn't spread. It didn't need to. The next morning, black SUVs rolled up along the gravel lot outside the marina. 4 men in dark jackets, faces drawn tight with purpose, asked for Proctor by name. They presented Navy identification, real, but vague. No division listed. No names offered. They asked no questions. They simply requested the fragments, not demanded. Requested. Polite, as if it didn't matter whether permission was given, as if they already knew where the pieces were. The metal was loaded into insulated containers, each one sealed and double-locked. Proctor asked if he'd receive any report, any follow-up. One of the men smiled thin, empty, and said, "For your own peace of mind, it's best not to ask." By afternoon, they were gone. So were the fragments. No paperwork followed. No official acknowledgement. Just the smell of diesel and the hollow scrape of empty floors. Weeks later, an anonymous tip was placed to a small university lab in Fairbanks. A graduate student working with experimental cryogenic materials claimed to have seen something strange: data sheets logged under an unknown military contract referencing corrosion patterns in subglacial environments. The student was fired within days. The records disappeared. But before they were erased, one entry was copied by hand, smuggled out on a scrap of paper, folded into a book. It read, "Material integrity, consistent with subcritical exposure at depths exceeding 2,500 meters. Signs of thermal compression not observed in any known vessel class. Outer surface molecular structure displays non-oceanic patterning." At the bottom, a single line had been added in red ink. Origin classified. Do not store above -30 degrees Celsius. Whatever had touched the Eldridge Bay had not only taken it, it had preserved it, held it in a kind of suspended decay, and when it was finally released, It brought with it the cold of a place no man was meant to enter. The sea had given up a piece of its secret, and the Navy had taken it right back. It surfaced in the bottom of an old footlocker, tucked between yellowed service manuals and a cracked leather shaving kit. The locker had belonged to Seaman Harold Kimball, one of the 23 men aboard the Eldridge Bay. After the Navy declared the vessel lost, his belongings were returned to his sister in Ohio, neatly packed and unceremoniously delivered by a uniformed courier who could not answer her questions. She had stored the trunk in her attic and left it untouched for over 2 decades, unwilling to open something that still smelled faintly of oil, sweat, and finality. But in 1986, after hearing a brief local report about fishermen pulling strange wreckage from the sea, she climbed the attic steps for the first time in years. She didn't know why. Perhaps it was the name Eldridge Bay spoken aloud again after so many years buried in silence. Or maybe it was the need to see his handwriting again, to confirm he had once existed beyond the lists and obituaries. The trunk creaked open like it had been holding its breath. Beneath a bundle of stiff socks and a folded wool cap, she found it. A single Polaroid photograph, creased at the corners and slightly curled with age. The colors had faded into a soft blue haze. The whites turned to sepia, but the image was still clear. 7 men, lined up across the deck of the ship, squinting into the pale Arctic Sunday. Their uniforms were clean, their posture loose. One of them, Harold, was smiling with a cigarette pinched in his fingers, mid-laugh. To his right stood a tall man in officer's stripes, his arm slung casually over the shoulder of a radio tech. In the background, barely visible, was the dark blur of ice. But there was something else in the frame. Just behind them, caught in the upper left-hand corner, was a shape. At first glance, it looked like a trick of the film, some light flare, some ghost of exposure, but it wasn't. It was too precise. A curve. A segment of something metallic and arching, emerging from the ice beyond the ship's stern. There were no notes, no identifying marks, no log of anything like it in the official record. But it was there. Looming, silent. On the back of the photo, in the tight, deliberate hand Harold always used when he was nervous, a single sentence was scrawled in pencil. "If this doesn't come back, tell Ruth I saw it." No date, no explanation. Just that. His sister mailed the photo to Ruth Halverson without a return address. She didn't include a letter. She didn't need to. Ruth opened the envelope at her kitchen table and stared at the image for hours, her tea gone cold, the winter wind scratching at the windows. She ran her fingers over the writing again and again, as if tracing the words would somehow bring him closer. If this doesn't come back. The photograph had made the journey, but not the man. Ruth folded the image carefully, pressed it into the back of her husband's old journal, and placed it inside a drawer she hadn't opened in years. Not because she had answers now, but because, for the first time in decades, she knew he had seen something. Something real. Something they had never intended to return. And somewhere, beneath that cold silence of the northern sea, it was still waiting. The file appeared in a nondescript manila envelope, slid beneath the office door of a retired naval historian in Annapolis in the spring of 1994. There was no return address, no explanation, only a single paperclip holding together 34 photocopied pages, brittle and gray from age. The cover bore no name, just a faded Navy crest and the words Operational Field Log, January 1964. Handwritten inside the margin of the first page, in script sharp with precision and fear, was the name Lieutenant Daniel Kerrigan, communications officer aboard the Eldridge Bay. The journal was never meant to see the light of day. It should have been incinerated with the rest of the ship's records, but someone had kept it. Someone had believed it mattered. The entries began like any other patrol log observations of barometric pressure, crew rotations, sonar pings, and daily maintenance notes. Kerrigan was methodical, almost obsessively so. He logged the time of every sunrise, the exact angle of wind currents, the metallic resonance of the hull during deep water dives. But as the days progressed, the language began to shift. The writing grew more frantic, less about metrics, more about atmosphere. January 11, 2:13 hours. Fog descended rapidly. Visibility reduced to less than 30 feet in all directions. Ice forms on decks in impossible patterns, concentric rings. No apparent wind. The fog doesn't move. January 12. Compass readings are unreliable. Magnetic drift inconsistent with prior Arctic patrols. Helm reports controls momentarily unresponsive during minor course correction. Resumed normal operation after 12 minutes. No mechanical fault recorded. January 13. Dreams again. Not mine, others too. Shared images. Several of us dreamed of the same shape. A structure, or maybe a vessel. Beneath the ice, lit from within. Crew is restless. Chaplain reports increased prayer activity. By the midpoint of the journal, Kerrigan's entries had abandoned protocol entirely. The writing looped erratically, margins filled with sketches, spirals, jagged lines, repeating glyphs not from any known alphabet. One page was soaked in what looked like spilled ink, but under close inspection revealed pressure points from a trembling hand. Beneath the black smear were just 4 words, over and over. "It watches from below." One passage stood out, transcribed verbatim. January 17. There is sound beneath us. Not sonar, not marine life. A pattern. Pulsing low, too low to hear but not to feel. It's in our bones. It vibrates through the hull. Chief engineer says the frequencies are bending the metal. He's wrong. The sound is not in the metal. It is in us. In later pages, Kerrigan began referring to the fog as if it were sentient. He described it creeping in through sealed vents, filling the lower decks with a smell like rotting flowers. He claimed to see shapes moving just beyond visibility, tall, limbless, not walking but gliding through the mist. Other crew members began to show signs of disorientation, confusion, repeating sentences as if caught in a loop. Then, abruptly, the entries stopped. The final page held no date, just a single line, centered and alone. We are past the map now. When the historian tried to trace the source of the document, he found nothing. No service record for Lieutenant Daniel Kerrigan in publicly accessible databases, no mention of him in official logs. The original journal, if it still existed, had vanished into the same silence that swallowed the Eldridge Bay. But the words lingered, ink pressed into memory. Some believe the journal was a hoax, crafted to stoke the fires of a long cold mystery. But those who read it, really read it, came away changed. They dreamed of fog, of silence, of shadows moving beneath black ice. And always, always, of something waiting just out of reach, something not made by men. The boy had been 6 when his father vanished. Too young to understand, too old to forget. For years, Daniel Halverson remembered the uniform, the scent of engine grease mixed with cologne, the way his father's hand had lingered on his shoulder before boarding the transport. One last glance, one quiet nod. Then the door closed. The next time he heard his father's name, it was being read from a casualty list by a man with too little emotion in his voice, presumed lost. No remains recovered. He grew into the kind of man his father might have been proud of. Quiet, steady, principled. A high school science teacher, then a physics professor. He didn't chase shadows. He didn't romanticize the past. But in the back of his mind, especially late at night, when the wind scraped the window panes, there remained a dull ache. The kind of ache that doesn't fade with time, only changes shape. It was never about conspiracy. It was about something much more mundane and cruel, the absence of truth. In 1998, after his mother passed, Daniel found a box buried in the back of her closet. It was old, worn smooth by time and the weight of grief. Inside were clippings, yellowed letters, a single wedding ring, and a notebook in her handwriting. At the very bottom lay a photo one he had never seen. 7 men, smiling aboard the Eldridge Bay, with his father in the center. Behind them, faint and blurred, something metallic protruding from the ice, something that didn't belong. That photograph was the beginning. Over the next 4 years, Daniel quietly began to dig. He filed FOIA requests, made cold calls to Navy offices, wrote letters to men who had once worn the same uniform his father had died in. Most never responded. Some replied with generic condolences. One man sent a postcard with no return address. It read, simply, "They told us not to ask." At night, Daniel studied old patrol maps, learned how to read sonar records, and combed archives for any mention of the Eldridge Bay beyond the bland footnotes of its disappearance. It was like chasing smoke through a keyhole. Files were missing, or conveniently redacted into near blankness. Transcripts referred only to the incident. Names were wiped clean. Then, one morning in early spring, he received an email. No subject line, no text. Just an attachment labeled 51.430, 9 degrees north, 178.9076 degrees west. The coordinates led to an uninhabited stretch of ocean far west of Attu Island, near a trench known for strange magnetics and broken sonar returns. It was, Daniel confirmed, precisely along the route the Eldridge Bay had last been tracked before vanishing. He never discovered who sent the coordinates. The email address went dead within hours, but someone, somewhere, had wanted him to look. Not to find closure. He was beginning to understand that closure was a fiction, but to understand, to witness, to stand at the edge of something terrible and know it had once breathed. 2 months later, Daniel stood on the deck of a chartered vessel, staring into the fog. He clutched the photograph in one hand, a GPS tracker in the other. The water beneath him was black, placid, and impossibly still. The sonar operator muttered that the scanner wasn't working properly, that it kept showing movement. Rising, sinking, reappearing. Daniel said nothing. He simply watched the water, his father's last words echoing in memory. Watch the tides. And the tide, he knew, was turning. They weren't supposed to be there. The permits issued to the research vessel Calliope were strictly for glaciology and water sampling, routine civilian science, comfortably distant from classified zones. But science has a habit of drifting where it shouldn't. The team had followed satellite anomalies, temperature fluctuations over the Bering Sea that defied pattern and prediction. What was expected to be a modest 6-week mission had turned into a chase across drifting ice shelves and sonar glitches that repeated in sequences, like messages lost in translation. On the 23rd day, they found it. A fissure, not wide, but deep like a wound in the skin of the Arctic. It had opened overnight, a jagged black mouth in a landscape of white. The glaciologists gathered with reverence, whispering measurements and murmuring about unprecedented melt behavior. But as the drone descended, slicing through mist and snow, the science turned to something else entirely. The camera pierced through the fog, beneath layers of splintered ice, and revealed metal. At first, it was difficult to understand the scale. A jagged structure protruded from the base of the fissure, buried in a half-collapse of ice and stone. The first impression was of a wrecked ship, crushed and frozen, pieces jutting at cruel angles, like ribs poking through a carcass. But it wasn't the Eldridge Bay. Or if it was, it had become something else entirely. There were curves where ships had no reason to curve. Sections that shimmered unnaturally beneath the ice, their surfaces too smooth, too unmarred by time. One panel, if it could even be called that, reflected light in ways that defied geometry. It bent shapes, shadows curled the wrong way, and nestled beside the metallic ruin was something worse, something older. The drone captured only 34 minutes of footage before it stopped responding. During those minutes, It hovered over what the lead researcher, Dr. Esme Calder, described as a non-terrestrial structure. Those were her words, carefully chosen, reluctantly spoken. She had been trained to be precise, rational. But what the feed showed could not be explained by any known engineering. Spiral columns. Repeating triangular recesses, each exactly 37.1 centimeters wide. Symbols etched into the structure, not writing, but grooves. Shapes that invoked vertigo just to look at. Patterns that seemed to shift between frames of the video. One technician vomited after watching the footage on loop. Another quit the expedition entirely. The Calliope remained silent for 2 days after that. No new broadcasts, no updates to its open research logs. When it finally resumed contact, its crew stated they had experienced a temporary electrical malfunction and were continuing data collection in an alternate region. The coordinates provided were hundreds of miles from the fissure. Weeks later, Dr. Calder would leave academia. Her resignation letter was brief. In it, she wrote only one thing that stood out, a line scribbled at the bottom beneath her signature. Some structures are not built, they wait. She never spoke publicly about what was found beneath the ice. But others had seen the footage before it vanished. Enough to know the truth was colder than the ocean that kept it hidden. The Eldridge Bay had gone down that trench. Yes, but it had not gone alone. Something was already there. And perhaps still was. Watching, preserved in ice older than civilization, older than memory. A cathedral of silence, not built by men. Not meant for them either. The black box was found by accident. A sonar research team from the Norwegian Institute of Marine Science had been mapping sub-ice plateaus when their equipment pinged off something too symmetrical to be natural. They assumed it was discarded equipment or a long-forgotten satellite relay pod. But what they pulled from the deep was a blackened, dented capsule no bigger than a shoebox, its outer shell coated in a strange lattice of frost that did not melt at room temperature. It bore no clear identification, no beacon, no modern interface. Only a stamped serial number on the base, EB641. It took weeks for analysts to extract anything usable. The interior circuitry was partially degraded, but the magnetic storage core, an older format used in Cold War-era naval vessels, remained intact. With meticulous care and reverse-engineered readers, they managed to extract hours of audio. Most of it was mundane: systems checks, coded transmissions, the low hum of the ship's engine, and the ambient creak of ice against the hull. But in one segment time-stamped January 15, 1964, at 0247 hours the audio began to change. The first thing heard is a low groan, not mechanical. It vibrates with a strange resonance, as if echoing from inside something vast and hollow. Then come footsteps, urgent, uneven. A voice mutters something, too faint to decipher. Another follows, whispering clearly, "Do not look at it. Do not look at it." There's static, then breathing. Heavy, panicked. A clatter as something metal hits the floor. More voices now, frantic, overlapping. It's outside again. That's not the stern light. It moved. I swear to God, it moved. The groan returns closer now, layered with a high-pitched whine that doesn't sound man-made. One crew member's voice comes through sharply, whispering as though afraid even the walls might be listening. "It's in our wake. Same shape, same lights, but it's not us." The others murmur in agreement, though none speak above a whisper. There is a kind of reverence in their fear, like they've seen something sacred and sickening at once. Then, something unexpected. Laughter, not manic, not deranged, childlike. It echoes from somewhere on the deck. The voices freeze. "Who's there?" No response. Just the sound again, soft giggling, distant but clear. The captain's voice cuts through the tension, calm but firm. "Seal the lower hatch. No one goes alone." "That's an order." Another voice trembling asks, "But sir, it..." It has our markings. Our number. It even has the scar on the starboard hull. A long silence follows. The audio fuzzes into distortion, but something else begins beneath the static. A rhythm, mechanical yet organic, like a heart beating through steel. Then the phrase that would echo through intelligence briefings for years, scribbled hastily in analyst margins, and never spoken aloud. It's mimicking us. The final few seconds of the recording degrade into a cascade of noise, metal on metal, a scream abruptly cut short, and then a deep, resonant hum that doesn't stop until the playback ends. The recording was never released to the public. The capsule itself disappeared within a week, last signed into custody by a naval research handler under a false name. But by then, the audio had already been copied. Passed in whispers, in basements and bunkers, among those who tracked the impossible. No one could explain what the crew of the Eldridge Bay had seen, only that it had seen them first. And whatever it was, it knew how to pretend. The man was found wandering the docks outside Sitka in the early hours of a gray November morning in 1989. He wore no coat despite the cold, only a threadbare undershirt and trousers that looked decades out of date. His feet were bare, his toenails black with frostbite, and his eyes were fixed on the horizon as if he were waiting for something to rise from it. When the harbor master tried to speak to him, he didn't answer. He simply raised one trembling hand and pointed toward the water. His lips moved, shaping silent words the wind carried away. When authorities finally arrived, he went quietly. No resistance, no confusion. Just a faint smile that never reached his eyes. He gave his name as Arthur Bell. There was no identification on him, no record of where he'd come from, and the only ship name he would utter was Eldridge Bay. When asked what year it was, he hesitated before answering, as though the question itself were foreign. "It's still cold," he said, voice rough from disuse. "Still dark under there." They admitted him to a small coastal asylum in Juneau. The staff assumed dementia or delusion, the kind that sometimes takes hold of men who've lived too long with the sea. But Arthur was different. He didn't ramble or drift. He was lucid, articulate, even intelligent when he chose to be. During the day, he spoke about engines and hull pressure, about Arctic patrol routes that matched old Navy records from the early 1960 seconds. His descriptions were so precise that one of the attendants contacted a naval archive out of curiosity. There was, indeed, an Arthur Bell listed in the Navy registry, but not as a crewman aboard the Eldridge Bay. His records placed him on the USS Merrimack, a supply vessel stationed near Japan in 1964. When asked about the discrepancy, Arthur only said, "They switched us. You think paper means truth? Paper burns." The doctors wrote it off as delusional association. Still, one of them, a young psychiatrist named Dr. Lorna Graves, began to take an interest in him. She noticed that he refused to speak once the sun went down. At dusk, his words would falter, and by nightfall, he'd go entirely silent, retreating into his room, eyes fixed on the corner ceiling where shadows pooled. Sometimes he'd begin to draw. Always the same patterns. Circles within triangles, intersecting spirals, waveforms that seemed to pulse even on the flat page. When she asked what they were, he said softly, "The maps they used, not for us, for them." His drawings were collected and analyzed. None matched any known navigational pattern, yet when overlaid with satellite images of the Arctic shelf, several of the lines aligned perfectly with seismic ridges discovered decades later. He could not have known that. He could not have guessed. During one session, Dr. Graves brought him an old photograph recovered from the archives, the crew of the Eldridge Bay on deck. Smiling in the weak Sunday, Arthur's hand trembled as he reached for it. He pointed to the far left edge of the frame, at a young man barely in view. "That's me," he whispered, before it started breathing. She checked again later. The young man he indicated bore some resemblance, yes, but the official roster listed no Arthur Bell among the crew. She confronted him with this the next morning. He only smiled faintly and said, "Records lie. Ice doesn't. It remembers what it takes." In 1991, Arthur Bell died quietly in his sleep. His room was found empty, except for his notebook filled edge to edge with symbols. In the final pages, written in faint pencil, were words that chilled even the staff who no longer believed his stories. "It isn't gone. It only changed its shape. Don't look for it after dark." That night, the power in the asylum flickered 3 times. And though the staff dismissed it as coincidence, one orderly swore he heard something through the walls, a low hum, like the sound of the ocean pressed against glass. The sonar tapes had sat untouched for decades, sealed in a climate-controlled archive under a misfiled designation. They were marked as routine acoustic mapping records, logged by a junior naval tech who had since died of old age, never knowing the true significance of what he'd preserved. The reels were magnetic, brittle with age, but intact. When they were finally digitized in 2003 as part of a naval modernization effort, a data technician flagged one file as corrupted. The waveform was strange, irregular, pulsing at uneven intervals, with gaps where sound should have continued. But it wasn't corrupted. It was something else. The recordings, when played, began with the usual clamor of a patrol vessel operating in the frigid quiet of the Arctic. The faint pings of active sonar, the creaking of the ship's metal bones as it pressed through icy water, and the distant churn of propellers in a rhythm as steady as a heartbeat. For nearly 20 minutes, the playback remained uneventful, just noise, the cold, slow murmur of a machine moving through the dark. Then the pattern broke. It started with a static bloom, a soft whine just beneath the edge of human hearing. The sonar pulses returned to the monitor distorted. Delayed. Something was disrupting the signal. A technician's voice is heard faintly in the background, confused, rechecking equipment. But the interference wasn't random. The echoes were bouncing off something massive, multiple objects moving at depth, then stopping, not drifting, not carried by current, but stopping with intention. A second voice comes in, calmer, older, maybe the sonar officer. He reads out the coordinates. The range is wide. Too wide. The return signal indicates at least 4 distinct masses beneath the Eldridge Bay, spaced evenly, each the size of a submarine but without heat signatures, without propulsion. They move again. This time, closer, slower, in unison. The technician asks, "What the hell swims in formation like that?" There's a pause, then static. The recording resumes with a rapid burst of sonar pings, desperation now, scanning all directions. And then, a chilling return. One of the objects had shifted to directly beneath the ship. Not behind. Not beside. Beneath. Depth unknown. The sonar stopped registering it. It didn't vanish. It just stopped echoing, as though the sound had been swallowed whole. One technician notes an impossible temperature drop in the water column. A layer of cold, denser than anything recorded, colder than the surrounding sea, colder than the known thermal limits of Arctic water. The microphones begin to pick up a new sound, low, layered, like breathing through a machine. Not steady, not human, measured, but wrong. The rest of the reel degrades into indecipherable hiss, broken only by the occasional reappearance of that same rhythmic static, always in threes, always followed by silence. When these recordings were brought to the attention of naval analysts in the early 2000s, most dismissed them. Equipment malfunction, ice shelf interference, the usual explanations. But one analyst, who had worked on classified sonar mapping in the 1980 seconds, quietly handed over a personal notebook filled with sketches, shapes resembling the recorded sonar traces. He'd seen them before. In a different ocean, on a different mission. He refused to elaborate. Only said, "It's not what we think it is. It's not swimming, it's waiting." The sonar tapes were quietly reclassified, sealed again, this time under a more deliberate label. But the data existed. The masses had been real. The movement had been real. Something had stirred beneath the patrol zone in 1964, something vast and methodical, reacting not to threat but to proximity. Salt and static were all the men of the Eldridge Bay had left to read. And in the final seconds of signal, before all sound failed, one last ping bounced back, late and warped but unmistakable in shape. The echo came from above. The leak came from a dying man. No grand exposé, no front-page headlines, just a flash drive slipped into a manila envelope and mailed anonymously to a defunct investigative newsletter in Baltimore. The return address was a lie, the sender untraceable. But the contents were real. Documents, memos, and internal communications stamped with layers of clearance, the kind that didn't officially exist. The watermark on every page bore the same phrase, Project Echo Protocol. The files dated back to late 1963, weeks before the Eldridge Bay began its final patrol. Most were dense, buried in the sterile language of military bureaucracy, strategic resource allocations, equipment requisitions, satellite pass requests. But scattered among them were fragments of something else entirely. Observations, incident reports. Words that didn't belong in a naval ledger. Temporal distortion, subacoustic resonance, unclassified geometries. The first file, dated November 9, 1963, detailed a classified sonar sweep over a trench near the Arctic continental shelf. The sweep was conducted by an unmanned drone, ostensibly mapping tectonic stress points. But the memo noted irregularities, symmetrical formations too precise to be natural, and sonar returns that bent back on themselves, signals looping as if reflected off nothing. Returning echoes out of sequence, the technician wrote. Like the signal was bounced from a moving target that mimicked the sender. Then, the next week, a meeting log. 6 officers, 1 civilian, gathered in a secure facility outside Kodiak. The agenda item was brief: response protocol to anomaly. Strategic feasibility of controlled exposure. Evaluate via Thresher-class trial. Beneath that, a handwritten note scribbled in the margin. Use asset with clean record, no press attachment, no relatives in service, contain outcome. That asset was the Eldridge Bay. Its crew was chosen not just for their skill, but for their silence. Men with no political connections, no public visibility. They were perfect for a mission no one would be told about. The official briefing given to the crew referenced weather monitoring and electronic calibration, an Arctic run with no risk, no combat engagement. But buried deeper in the files were operational codes that told another story. Operation Node 3. Route alignment with previously recorded phenomenon field. Continuous sonar monitoring, passive broadcast equipment activated. And then the final line in bold. Observe and report interaction. No intervention. Loss parameters accepted. They knew. Not everything, not fully. But enough to send those 23 men toward something the rest of the Navy only whispered about. Anomalies had been appearing in sonar grids for months, perhaps years, always in cold waters, always too symmetrical. Echoes with no source, shapes with no heat signature. A mimicry of human design that shifted just beyond detection. Project Echo Protocol wasn't an investigation. It was a test. The files confirmed what families of the crew had long suspected in their quiet, bitter hearts. Their sons and husbands had been sacrificed for data. No rescue protocols were ever planned. The moment communication ceased, the files show, recovery efforts were stalled deliberately. A memo from January 24, 1964, reads, Response team instructed to delay approach. Observation of long-term anomaly persistence prioritized over recovery. In simpler terms, they wanted to see what would happen if the ship vanished. And it had. Clean. Without a trace. The whistleblower who released the files never stepped forward. It was later discovered he had died of pancreatic cancer, 2 weeks before the envelope was received. But in his final act, he gave the world a piece of truth, an awful, necessary truth. The Eldridge Bay hadn't been lost, it had been sent, pushed into the dark by hands that already suspected what lay beneath the ice. And whatever responded had done so with precision, with mimicry, with purpose. Because something down there had been listening for a long time. And now, it knew how we sounded. The descent began like all the others, routine, procedural, safe within the boundaries of known technology. The expedition had been greenlit by a private research firm operating under a shell organization, the sort of company whose funding trails led nowhere and whose personnel records read like fiction. The mission was simple on paper: deep-sea inspection of a glacial fissure using live divers and autonomous drones to verify sediment structures and subglacial anomalies. The coordinates, however, told a different story. They matched the last known position of the Eldridge Bay. The dive team comprised 3 men, veterans of commercial salvage and military operations. No strangers to darkness, pressure, and the unpredictable behavior of the deep. But as they passed the 1,500-meter mark, something shifted. The water didn't feel right. Not just cold, oppressive. It pressed against their suits like a memory too old to belong to the living. The first sign was the compasses. They spun in place, erratic, then stopped altogether, as if they no longer recognized direction. Digital sensors flickered, rebooted, then displayed nonsense readings, altitudes instead of depths, timestamps that reversed themselves mid-log. The support crew topside thought it was interference from nearby geological formations. Glacial deposits, electromagnetic distortion, textbook excuses. But then the cameras began to fail. Not all at once, but one by one, like dying stars. Footage corrupted in real time, colors bleeding into each other, outlines pulsing with static halos. Still, the divers continued, moving deeper into the trench's mouth. At 1,870 meters, they encountered a field of debris. The sonar had shown nothing, but as their lights swept across the ocean floor, shapes emerged. Not natural ones, steel, bent and folded. Rivets warped from pressure or heat. A ladder half embedded in sediment. Something that might have once been part of a bulkhead, now curled like a dead leaf. And scattered among the wreckage, fragments of uniform cloth, fibers too intact for their age. One diver, James Ayers, moved closer to inspect a rusted panel, and then his voice cut out. His signal was lost. 3 minutes passed. To those on the surface, it felt longer. They called his name, issued commands, switched to backup comms. No response. His beacon still registered motionless, hovering just above the seabed, but he was gone. Then, without warning, he came back online. His voice was low, breathless, not quite his. He said only one word: found. When they brought him up, he was barely conscious. His suit was intact. No punctures, no visible injury. But his hand refused to open, clenched so tightly they had to sedate him. And when his fingers finally uncurled, they found it. A rusted dog tag, edges jagged, lettering worn thin by time and salt. One name still legible. Lieutenant Frank Halvorsen. The room fell silent. Ayers wouldn't speak of what happened down there, not immediately. But later, in fits and whispers, he described seeing light, impossible light, moving in patterns below the wreckage. Shapes rising from the silt, not swimming, but unfolding. And a face, not human, not alien. A reflection of himself, but wrong, distorted, watching him through the glass of his visor from just beyond the beam of his torch. "The water remembered me," he said once, before he stopped speaking entirely. "It knew I wasn't supposed to be there." The dog tag was real, verified, unmistakable. But the Navy refused to comment on its recovery, and Ayers never dove again. He left the expedition, changed, not broken, not afraid. Just emptied. as if something had taken part of him in those 3 minutes and filled the void with silence. Because the depths don't forget. They remember what was taken, what was sent, and sometimes they give back just enough to remind us that what we lost wasn't lost at all. It was claimed. The press conferences never last more than a few minutes. Each year, as whispers of renewed interest surface, another leak, another unexplained signal, another recovered artifact, the Navy steps forward briefly, always with the same refrain. We have no further comment regarding the USS Eldridge Bay or its final patrol. The matter remains closed. No apology, no acknowledgement, not even the dignity of a lie with substance. Just the endless turning of a bureaucratic wheel, worn smooth from decades of denial. In truth, most of the world had moved on. The Cold War had thawed, the century had turned, and history had developed a remarkable ability to forget the things it was never allowed to understand. But for the families, forgetting was not a luxury. For them, the Eldridge Bay was not a footnote or an unsolved anomaly. It was a missing chair at dinner, a pair of boots never worn again, a name spoken in a quiet house that no longer echoed back. Each year, on the anniversary of the ship's disappearance, they gathered. Some drove from other states. Some were wheeled in by children they had once carried in arms. They came wrapped in coats and scarves, carrying thermoses of coffee and folded lawn chairs. They set up along the shoreline just outside of Kodiak, where the sea is quiet and the wind carries memory more gently than most places. They didn't chant, they didn't protest, they simply waited. Photographs were pinned to small wooden boards, staked into the sand, portraits of young men in pressed uniforms, frozen in the grayscale of the 1,960 seconds. Some held flowers, others brought letters, folded neatly and left atop stones as if the tide might carry them the rest of the way. A few still brought radios, tuned to static, listening for something they could not name. There was a dignity in their patience. Not resignation, never that. It was a quiet refusal to let the narrative die completely. Even as hands trembled and voices grew thin with age, they came back each year. Not for closure. Closure had long since soured into something cruel, a word used to end conversations. What they wanted was truth. And the truth, they knew, would never come from behind a podium. One year, a child grandson of a lost radioman asked his mother why they still came. "If they're gone," he said, "what are we waiting for?" She knelt beside him, hand resting gently on his shoulder. "We're waiting to be heard," she said. Not answered, just heard. A documentary team once tried to film the gathering. The families declined. They weren't interested in spectacle. Their grief was not a story. It was a vigil. And so, the Navy's silence endured. Their records remained sealed. The few officials who might have known more had long since retired, many to quiet deaths, their secrets untouched. Even those who wanted to speak found themselves bound by layers of oaths, paper-thin but unbreakable. But the sea remembered. And so did the ones who waited. They would return next year, and the year after, as long as they were able. And when they no longer could, their children would take their place, standing beside the tide, eyes fixed on the horizon where the ice begins, and the truth waits unchanged, unmoved, unresolved. The footage begins with static, a flicker of distortion, the grain of old tape worn thin by time and salt. The timestamp in the corner reads August 2nd, 1986, though for years, this segment of video had been classified, buried, or simply ignored. It had been recovered from an archival vault by accident, misfiled under marine salvage rather than military investigation. The label on the case read only 286 Maribel June. Someone, somewhere, had seen fit to forget it. As the static clears, the deck of the Maribel June comes into view. The camera is handheld, bobbing slightly, the lens smudged with sea spray. The ocean behind them is gray and endless, the kind of flat that feels too still, too quiet. In the foreground, The ship's net groans as it crests the winch, heavy with something unseen. The deckhands move without speaking, eyes fixed on the net like they already know something is wrong. The usual banter is absent. Even the wind seems to hold its breath. The net thuds against the deck, splashing water across the lens. As the camera operator wipes it clean, the shape becomes visible. A twisted, rusted husk of corroded steel, wrapped in kelp and time. One piece juts upward like a broken antenna. Another, wide and flat, resembles the edge of a bulkhead. The metal isn't just old. It's unnatural in its decay, the kind of corrosion that seems less like weathering and more like surrender, as if whatever it touched pulled the life from it. The camera zooms in, unsteady but deliberate. A deckhand kneels, pulling at a tangled mass near the center of the wreckage. There's a moment almost too quick to catch where something inside shifts. Not a living movement, but a settling, a change in weight. Then comes the reveal. A boot. Half buried, wedged between two collapsed panels, the leather fused with rust. The camera tightens, the resolution shaking with every heartbeat. It's military issue, unmistakably old, the heel marked with an embossed USN. As the wreckage is gently pried apart, the boot falls slightly forward, revealing what's inside. A human skeleton, curled inward, knees tucked to chest in a fetal position. The bones are pale, almost translucent in the cold light, preserved in a way that defies nature. Time should have devoured it. But here it is, intact, encased like an offering. One skeletal hand clutches something tightly against the ribcage, a flare gun, oxidized but whole, its trigger rusted in place. The camera lingers, no one speaks. The hum of the ship's generator buzzes faintly in the background, almost reverent. Later analysis would confirm the flare gun model matched those issued to the Eldridge Bay in the early 1960s. The boot, too, matched inventory records. But the dog tag found nearby, corroded but legible, sealed it. Halverson, Frank L. Lieutenant Kemder, USN. The footage ends with the camera pulling back slowly, revealing the scale of the wreckage in full. It's not just a fragment of ship, it's a piece of history unearthed by accident, a grave not meant to be found. But more haunting than what the camera shows is what it implies. He hadn't drowned. He hadn't been swept overboard. He had stayed, hidden, alone. Clutching a flare gun, waiting in the dark, curled as if trying to keep something out or something in. There is no scream, no cry for help. Just the final image of a man who never left his post. A silent sentinel buried beneath decades of ocean and ice, waiting for someone, anyone, to finally see him. The sea gave him back. And in doing so, it whispered the truth more clearly than any document or memo ever could. They were never lost. They were taken.